Dragon Age The Veilguard got a massive gameplay reveal at Gamescom with over 10 minutes of new gameplay, a look at the builds, companions, and more, but there's this really cool stuff that I haven't seen a lot of people discussing, so let's talk about it. Let me know if you're excited for Dragon Age The Veilguard in the comments down below. We'll start with the abilities themselves. Now, from the initial gameplay reveal and a lot of the information that has come out, as far as we knew, there were only 4 abilities, like active abilities that you would use other than your light and heavy attacks. Technically, that is true. However, what we saw in this gameplay, especially when looking at our build and like our overall setup, is the rune system. So you'll have 3 runes that you can apply to yourself. Now, these all have a passive bonus, like for example Mend, that increases your healing received, but it also has an active ability that you can lose all your rage and then heal based on that amount. Or something like that we actually see used in the gameplay is Crystallize, which is another rune that will freeze enemies within a 10-meter radius of you. So you could almost count these as additional abilities. Like, they're not necessarily the same, and these will be, I assume, the runes will be consistent across all the different classes, but it seems like some of those additional abilities and effects that are just more general have been moved to this rather than just being like abilities that you can cast. On top of that though, we do know as well, you've got like your heavy attacks. Like throughout this champion, this warrior's gameplay, we see them throw the shield or use like a shield bash. It's hard to see if which is the actual heavy attack, if it's the throw or the bash, but there does seem to be that additional option. Plus the ultimate ability, right? Like there's the Warden's ultimate ability that we do see used throughout this gameplay. Now, something to point out that did come out in the blog as well is that abilities require class resources. You actually see this for the warrior underneath, like the ability marker. There's like that build up of warrior's rage, as a warrior will use rage as their mechanic, which is mostly gained from dealing basic attacks. Now for a rogue, they have momentum, which is mostly gained from dodging attacks and parrying successfully. And for the mage, which we actually did get a tiny little bit of mage gameplay, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this video, you gain mana, which you get passively over time. Another detail that I saw on the build screen is gear scaling. Now you've got your typical ones like your uncommons and your rares, and then I assume epic and stuff after that. But something to note is that all the gear that we look at here has like these various slots that gain passive bonuses. Now those slots seem to be linked to the rarity level of the gear, right? The uncommon gear that we see only has 1 slot available. Rare gear has 2 slots available, and then one could assume that epic and above will have 3. We also do see a unique ring that the player has, the Andraste's ring, which is perfect for the fire build that this champion is actually using. So it's good to know that there will actually be unique, like legendaries type gear that you'll be able to find, assuming through like quest lines or just like finding out in the world. I'm definitely keen to hunt down any of that unique gear that we do find. The most interesting detail on this screen to me personally is this one locked slot on the helmet that the player is wearing, which says that you gain 10% stagger relative to the Lords of the Fortune allied strength. Specifically, what this means, I have no idea. But interestingly, the Lords of the Fortune is one of the backgrounds that you can get during the game, and I do believe that Tash, one of the companions, is actually from the Lords of the Fortune faction as well. So what that allied strength actually means, we'll have to wait and see. Is it like your relationship with Tash and like that faction itself? Like what that allied strength refers to is, it's really interesting, but it does seem that these backgrounds will actually affect gameplay in that sort of a way, right? Like obviously you can expect that in dialogue they will have impacts. We even saw that in the original gameplay reveal where Harding actually refers to the player being a part of the Shadow Dragons. This leads me to believe that there's going to be a bit more than just say like the dialogue options this is going to affect. I'm really interested to see how deep this actually goes, what it does actually affect. And also, you know, you could also assume that with Tash, right, you would have a much easier time connecting with that companion because of your background as well. Speaking of those companions, they also have builds that you can modify by equipping them with different gear and outfits, etc. Interestingly as well, you can make these have a bit more synergy related to your overall player character. Like the example we show is like the fire build the champion has and how that's relevant to the builds that the companions are using as well. On that companion screen, we do see a few interesting things, like underneath Davron's name on the left hand side there is the number 4 and it says Comrade in Arms. My guess there is that is your personal affinity or your relationship with them. You can also see their damage numbers underneath that, the different gear abilities they have equipped, and then on the right hand side you also see their skill tree, which does look very different to the the player's overall skill tree. Like, it's not as complex and as deep, but there does still seem to be a lot of complexity in terms of your various options that you can pick on that skill tree. As you move over to the companion select screen, we do also see that your companions will be required for certain missions. Like, as this is a Grey Warden mission, Davron is required to attend for this mission. So companions will be relevant to missions and have to come and join you on certain missions. I actually really like this companion screen as well, by the way. It does touch on, what applies and detonates the different companions can do. I'll explain that a little bit more detail in a little bit, but it also does give us a little bit more information on the different companions as well and some of their unique parts of their kit. Like, say, Davron, for example, that can summon a griffin during combat. We also see Emmerich for half a second, who is a Navarian professor of death summoned spirits. So I'm really interested to play around with those spirit summons, and I'm excited to build like a necromancy army with Emmerich. A brief look at Harding and her poison slinging scouts, arrows, shock, and shred. And then Lucanus, the swift and precise assassin with a demonic aura, who also has the detonator for overwhelm. Now, speaking of those detonations, there's a sort of a two-part step here, being the applies and the detonates. Now, you also see on that screen what the different companions can apply and detonate, but you yourself as the player has abilities, and you can see that on the skill tree as well, of what can apply and what can actually detonate. This is that combo system and being able to combo these abilities with your companions. The apply effect, or say the primer effect, allows you to prime something for it to actually be detonated. So in this case with Davron, you might be applying overwhelm and then detonating that effect with a detonator ability. And you can see on the ability wheel if you can actually combo these abilities together. When you do have a combo available, they do pop up and say combo opportunity. The example that's shown during this section is having the player overwhelm with grappling spear and then having Lucanus eviscerate, which then detonates that overwhelmed effect. Throughout the gameplay sections as well, we do also see multiple different types of health bars. Now, one thing to note here is that when you bring up the ability wheel that pauses the game, you can actually see the resistances and the weaknesses of all of the various enemies, like these being Darkspawn, right? They are resistant to necrotic and vulnerable to fire damage, which is why we're obviously running a fire build for this champion character. Now, this is a tiny bugbear, but I'm assuming it's just because they are resistant to necrotic, which is why that is green on the UI. But also something to note is that abilities that can exploit weaknesses have like a little green aura around them. That just bothers me, like in terms of colors being the same, but I'm certain that's just because the necrotic color is green, right? But that's neither here nor there. The other interesting thing about this whole system is the health bars. Now, the most common health bar you see, right, is red. That's your obvious, it's just your standard health. Throughout the gameplay, we also see a yellow health bar, which is armor. It's mentioned in the combat blog that armor is best removed using heavy attacks. We also see a blue health bar at various times. This is shield, and that's best removed with ranged attacks. And then there's a lavender, or it's just purple, right? Like it's purple for us boring people that don't use fancy words, but the purple bar is actually the stagger meter. And when you fill that bar up, it creates an opportunity for bonus damage as well as special takedown animations. Now, very early on in the gameplay as well, when we do get a look at Rook's skill trees, you can see just how wide and deep this is, right? You've got that middle ring as well. That is obviously all of your standard passives and everything. And there's survivability, there's weapons, there's abilities. And then on top of that, you've got your specializations. And for the warrior, this is Reaper, which becomes the Knight's Blade, steal life and risk death to gain incredible unnatural abilities. The Slayer, which allows you to leap into the fray, wield massive punishing weapons while rushing enemies to deal devastating blows. And the Champion, which is the gameplay we see today, be the Shield, shrug off damage while summoning righteous fire down on enemies. For the Rogue, you have the Duelist to draw your steel, parry and dodge past enemies to gain strength with every strike. The Saboteur to set the stage to deploy explosive and turrets that devastate enemies, then pick them off with arrows. And the Veil Ranger, hunt the enemy, snipe enemies from afar using artifacts that charge arrows with dangerous, powerful magic. Now for the Mage, we see a tiny little bit of gameplay in the NVIDIA trailer, but the three specializations here are the Deathcaller to embrace the dark, drain life from enemies and cast spells that wreath with the essence of death itself. The Evoker to call the void, freeze enemies in their tracks, then summon the deepest cold to tear them apart. And the Spellblade, be the storm, channel potent spells with close range combat infused with lightning's wrath. The Mage gameplay does only show you using a staff, but it has been mentioned you can use a dagger and like a magic orb as well, so that's probably that Spellblade gameplay. Now the entire skill tree is also fully refundable. You can actually see that when they're looking at skills, there's a refund button, so you can respec freely there, which is something that I absolutely love. And speaking of that NVIDIA trailer, we did get a breakdown of the various settings you'll get on PC. We do know this is going to be a native Steam client. You won't need the EA app for any of that stuff, but you can see a breakdown of the various settings, like all of your ultra wides, your ray tracing, your DLSS, all that stuff is here. So I'm quite impressed with the complexity and the depth you've got there, and I am actually very interested to tinker with that myself. Now, the one last thing I wanted to touch on here is mostly a personal thing, but with that initial gameplay reveal where we saw that very early gameplay of Rook playing as a rogue, I didn't feel like there was a lot of fluidity in the combat. It looked maybe a little bit like slow and like uncomplex, and I think part of that is because it is like level 1 gameplay. I was actually really impressed with this like late game gameplay. Like obviously you've got your rolls, your heavy attacks, your light attacks, your abilities, your ultimate ability that's used as well, but the environmental kills and the way you can sort of manipulate the enemies, even with the explosive barrels, the combat does look a lot more enjoyable and fun to play around with the later you get into it. Obviously it makes sense, right? The more you unlock, the more fun it gets, but I was quite impressed to see sort of the stark difference between that early rogue gameplay where you're kind of just swinging away and you get staggered out of a lot of attacks and stuff, compared to this much later gameplay where you're really fighting and taking things on head on and smacking enemies and Sparta kicking them off like the ledge and stuff. I really thought that was a fun time. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.